Harold had not planned on raising his hand at the auction until he heard the way the other men laughed at the unit nobody wanted. It was a gray Saturday morning, the kind where the sky sat low and heavy over the self-storage lot, and a dozen people shuffled from door to door while the manager cut locks and rolled up metal shutters. Most units looked the same when they opened. Boxes, old furniture, piles of clothes, the usual leftovers of other people's lives. But when they came to number 47, the manager gave a small snort, shook his head, and tugged the door up just a little. From where Harold stood, he saw only one thing: the curved tops of several enormous plastic barrels, jammed so close together you couldn't see the floor. Someone behind him muttered, "Nope, that's trouble," and the group moved back a step. "Hazmat special," another bidder joked, and the crowd laughed. No one bid. The manager's eyes swept over the small circle of faces, a flicker of annoyance crossing his expression. Harold had been ready to walk away too, but something in that lonely, unwanted space tugged at him. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came when he thought about his daughter and granddaughter 3 states away, and the quiet shame of not being able to do much for them anymore. Before he could talk himself out of it, he raised his hand and offered the minimum. No one countered. Just like that, the unit with the barrels belonged to him. He drove home in his old pickup with the auction receipt folded neatly in his pocket, the paper almost too crisp against his work-worn fingers. The truck rattled slightly on the highway, every noise reminding him that it would not survive many more long trips. That was the problem, really. Years ago, when he was still working full-time as a maintenance mechanic at the manufacturing plant, a drive across 3 states to see his daughter Emily and his granddaughter Lori had been nothing. He would gas up on a Friday after work, put a cooler in the back, and be there by Saturday afternoon. Then the plant closed, his savings evaporated into medical bills and mistakes, and the fights about money started. He had promised to help Emily with a loan when she and her husband were trying to buy their house. He meant it. Then everything fell apart at once, and the payments he had guaranteed did not come. She had called him one night with a tight, brittle voice and a list of numbers he could not argue with. That conversation had ended with silence, the kind that lasted for months and then years. Now he followed their lives from a distance. A birthday photograph in a holiday card, a school picture tucked into a letter from her husband, who wrote politely even when she would not. Harold kept every piece of paper in a shoebox under his bed, reading them on the evenings when the trailer felt too quiet. The unit he had bought that morning represented something he hadn't allowed himself in a long time, a small, shaky kind of hope. He was not foolish enough to believe in miracles packed away in dusty corners, but he knew how tools and equipment and used materials could still be worth something to the right buyer. All his life he had turned broken things into working ones, had looked at rust and grime and seen the outline of what they could be again. If those huge barrels inside the unit contained anything salvageable, scrap, industrial parts, something he could clean, sort, and sell, maybe he could fix more than just worn-out machines. Maybe he could fix a piece of his own life. When he pulled into the small trailer park that afternoon, the place looked the same as always. Faded siding, lines of laundry, the neighbor's dog watching from a window. He sat behind the wheel longer than usual, looking at the steering wheel and thinking about how many miles separated him from the people he still called family in his mind, even if the word did not pass between them. The thought of rolling up to Emily's house one more time in this old truck, with nothing to offer but apologies, made his shoulders sag. He wanted to arrive with dignity, not as a burden. That was what the unit was about, he realized. Not just money. Dignity. Sleep did not come easily that night. He tried to distract himself with the small routines he had built since retirement. Simple dinner, a call to an old coworker, the quiet company of the late-night news. But his thoughts kept circling back to those giant blue and gray shapes he had glimpsed in the half-open door. They had looked almost like soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the view of whatever lay behind them. He replayed the comments from the other bidders, the half-jokes about chemicals and hazard signs. They had made light of it, but Harold knew enough about industry to understand that some containers did carry things better left alone. He had worked around solvents, cleansers, and things you had to lock up behind warning labels. In his younger days, he would have gone charging into that unit without a second thought, sure he could handle whatever he found. Now, lying in bed with his hands crossed behind his head, he felt the weight of every year in his bones. He could not afford a mistake. He could not afford a hospital bill. And yet, somewhere underneath the caution, there was a quiet voice whispering that he had spent too many years letting fear decide for him. He woke before dawn the next morning, the sky outside his small window still the color of slate. The clock read 5:30, but his body had grown used to early hours from decades of starting shifts before sunrise. He brewed coffee in the old machine he had repaired himself, the familiar drip and hiss grounding him. As he waited, he looked at the faded photograph held by a magnet on his refrigerator door. Lori sat on a swing in that picture, hair flying, mouth wide open, and a laugh so full and unself-conscious it hurt his chest to look at it. She had been 5 then. She would be 12 now. He imagined her face older, her laugh maybe quieter, her questions sharper. Would she even recognize him if he showed up at her doorstep unannounced? Would she want to? He wrapped his fingers around the warm mug and stood there longer than he meant to, studying the photograph as if it could answer any of those questions. It did not. But it did remind him why he had raised his hand at that auction when everyone else stepped back. If there was even a chance, however small, that he could turn the contents of that strange unit into a way to see her again, he had to try. Later that morning, Harold's truck rolled back into the storage facility, its engine rumbling steadily if not confidently. The lot was quieter than the day before. The crowd of bidders had dispersed, the temporary excitement replaced by the usual routine of tenants coming and going. A breeze moved dust across the asphalt, and the metallic clang of a distant door rolling shut echoed between the rows of units. He parked near number 47 and took a moment to gather himself before stepping out. The unit's door looked the same as yesterday, except now a small sticker marked it with his name and the date. Seeing it there brought a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. He walked up slowly, feeling the slight grit of gravel under his boots, and rested his hand on the cool metal. The manager had told him to be careful, to call the office if he thought anything inside looked dangerous. Harold had nodded, appreciating the warning, but he also knew that this was his responsibility now. Whatever lay behind that door belonged to him, for better or worse. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he crouched to inspect the frame the way the door met the concrete. No odd stains on the ground. No chemical smells leaking from the cracks. No warning signs taped up by the previous tenant. Just a closed space waiting. He took the small key from his pocket, turned it in the hasp, and felt the lock give with a soft, clean click. For a long moment he held the handle and did nothing, his mind flickering through possibilities. Maybe it was all empty plastic, nothing but old containers someone hadn't wanted to pay to dispose of properly. Maybe the barrels were filled with worthless leftovers, stones, dirt, scraps. Or maybe, in the strangest version of all, there was something inside that could buy him not only a better truck but a seat at his daughter's table again. He exhaled slowly, aware that whatever he found was not going to erase the past, but it might give him a way to face it. The unit stood silent, the metal cool under his fingers, as if even it were waiting to see whether he would go through with what he'd started. He straightened up, set his feet firmly, and began to lift the door. The springs creaked gently above him, the metal shutter rolling upward inch by inch. A line of darkness appeared at the bottom, widening slowly, but he stopped before it rose high enough for him to see anything more than shadows. His heart had started to pound in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of his last checkup at the clinic. He eased the door back down until it closed with a soft thud, then stepped away. Not yet, he decided. Opening that unit would change something, and he wanted to do it when his hands were steady and his thoughts were clear. There was still time to fetch gloves, maybe a mask, ask the manager quietly if he knew anything more about the previous renter. This was not a race. The barrels were not going anywhere. For now, it was enough that he had come this far, enough that the key in his pocket meant there was still a door in his life he had not closed. As Harold walked back to the truck, the late morning sun began to break through the thin clouds, laying pale light across the rows of metal doors. He glanced back at number 47 once more. He could not see inside, but he didn't need to. The mystery of it tugged at him all the same. Somewhere in that dark, crowded space, beneath plastic lids and whatever someone had decided to hide away, lay an answer to a question he had carried for too long. Whether it was still possible, at his age and with his mistakes, to take one bold step that led somewhere better instead of somewhere worse. He slid behind the wheel, gripped it with both hands, and let the engine idle for a moment. He would come back with a plan, with the right tools, with enough courage to lift that door the rest of the way. When he did, whatever waited behind those barrels would no longer be a secret. And for the first time in many years, the thought of uncovering the unknown felt less like a threat and more like a chance. By the time Harold returned to the storage yard 2 days later, he had managed to talk himself through every worst-case scenario he could imagine and still decided to come back. The sky was clearer this time, a pale blue stretched thin above the low buildings, and the air carried the dry, familiar smell of sun-warmed asphalt. He had come prepared: heavy work gloves, a simple dust mask, an old flashlight he trusted more than the phone in his pocket, and a folded tarp in the back of the truck. As he parked near Unit 47, his heart beat a little too hard for his liking. but there was a steadiness under the nerves that hadn't been there before. He had called the facility office the day before, quietly asking if the previous tenant had ever caused trouble. The manager had checked the computer and shrugged over the phone. "Just another delinquent account," he'd said. Guy stopped paying. No complaints, no police, nothing on file. That didn't clear every doubt, but it was enough for Harold to decide that fear alone wasn't going to keep that door shut. He unlocked the unit with a small, decisive twist of the key and rolled the door up higher this time, wincing slightly as the metal rattled in its tracks. The dim interior slowly revealed itself as the sunlight crept into the space. What he'd seen as vague shapes before came into focus: rows of enormous plastic barrels, packed so tightly they left only a narrow path along one wall. Some were blue, others gray or black, a few sun-faded into uncertain colors. A handful still had partial labels clinging to their sides, but the ink had bled and peeled, leaving only outlines and stray numbers. The rest were bare, anonymous cylinders. They stood almost as tall as his chest, with thick lids clamped down by sturdy rings. Harold stepped inside cautiously, the concrete cold under his boots, and let his eyes adjust. There was no immediate smell beyond dust and old plastic. No sharp chemical bite in the air. No buzzing equipment. Just silence, thick and watchful, as if the barrels themselves were holding their breath. He moved along the first row, running his gloved hand lightly over the curved surfaces. Some lids were scratched, others almost new. A few had faint marker scribbles in handwriting he didn't recognize, cryptic notes like Batch C and Test 3, half washed away. It didn't help his nerves. He paused at a blue barrel near the front, leaned closer and sniffed cautiously near the seam. Nothing. No gasoline, no solvent, no sourness. Just the neutral, slightly stale scent of stored plastic. He tried another, this time a gray one with a fragment of an old shipping sticker hanging from its side. Still nothing alarming. The lack of obvious danger calmed him a little, but it also made everything feel stranger. People didn't usually go to the trouble of renting a unit to hide empty containers. Someone had filled these for a reason. Someone had taken time to seal them properly and stack them in straight, almost military lines. It was that care, that deliberate effort, that unnerved him more than the barrels themselves. Harold stood in the narrow aisle and considered his next step. He could close the door, call a professional cleanup service, and let them deal with everything. It would be safer, and no one would fault a man his age for being cautious around unknown industrial containers. But that path came with its own cost. He would likely lose any potential value inside. More than that, he would hand over the only chance he'd had in years to do something that might change his situation. The thought of calling his daughter with nothing but another apology and no way to back it up made his throat tighten. He had let life happen to him for a long time: plant closures, illnesses, falling savings, drifting family. This unit was the first thing in a long while that was his choice, his risk. He didn't want to give it away just because he was afraid of what might be under a lid. He chose the least threatening barrel he could find. One of the blue ones closest to the door, with no label and a slight scuff near the bottom that suggested it had been rolled rather than lifted into place. It felt like the kind of container someone might have used for storage rather than chemicals. At least, that was the hope he clung to. He positioned the tarp on the floor beside it, smoothing the edges with careful hands, then wrapped his gloved fingers around the metal ring that locked the lid down. For a moment he remembered standing in factory yards decades ago, opening drums of parts and supplies without a second thought. Back then, his back hadn't ached like this, and his hands hadn't needed a moment to loosen before gripping. He drew a slow breath, braced his feet, and pulled. The ring resisted, creaked, then gave with a sudden metallic snap that echoed sharply off the walls. The sound made him flinch, but nothing else happened. No hiss. No fumes. Just the lid loosening its seal with a tired sigh of plastic. He set the ring aside and pried up the edge of the lid, lifting it cautiously. A faint, dry rustle met his ears, like cloth moving against itself, or something small shifting. He froze, sniffed again, and felt his eyebrows draw together. The smell that rose from the open barrel wasn't chemical at all. It was mild. Familiar. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing, then blinked in surprise. Inside, filling the barrel nearly to the top, was a smooth, pale layer of grains. Rice. Plain, dry, uncooked rice. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile the sight with the fear he had carried. Of all the things he had imagined inside these drums, a ton of rice hadn't even made the list. He reached in, letting a handful sift through his gloved fingers, watching the small white grains pour back into the barrel like a quiet waterfall. They felt normal. They smelled normal. They were normal. And yet the situation was anything but. The question arrived almost immediately. Why would someone fill an industrial barrel with rice and lock it away in a storage unit? Harold sank down onto a milk crate that stood nearby, still within arm's reach of the open container, and let the thought settle. It didn't make sense as simple food storage. Not at this scale, not in plastic like this, not in a rented unit with no climate control. He thought about all the strange habits he'd seen in co-workers over the years. Men who kept jars of bolts sorted by size in their kitchens, women who stored fabric in old tool chests. People used what they had. But this felt different. It felt deliberate in a way that didn't match any practical need. He looked down at the rice again, at the perfectly level surface disturbed now by the small hollow his hand had made, and something inside him shifted. If this was odd, maybe the other barrels were even stranger. If someone had gone to such trouble to hide ordinary food in one, what might they have tucked beneath more dangerous-looking contents in another? A thought flickered through his mind, unwelcome at first and then increasingly hard to ignore. In the plant, when something valuable needed hiding, instruments, tools, small parts that weren't supposed to leave the premises, workers sometimes tucked them into the least interesting boxes. Not in the locked cage, but behind the boxes of scrap rubber, inside the crate of worn-out packing material, under the bin of reject parts. Hide value in something that looks worthless. People's eyes slide right over it. Harold stared at the rice and felt that old, familiar pattern of thinking awaken, the one that looked not just at what was there but at why it was there. He dug his hand a little deeper into the grains and felt them close coolly around his glove. The sensation was oddly soothing and unsettling at the same time. His fingertips brushed against something that didn't match the texture of rice for a fraction of a second, and he jerked his hand back, heart suddenly thudding faster. He told himself it could have been anything, a clump of hardened grains, a bit of plastic, some fragment that had fallen in by accident. Still, the memory of that faint, solid resistance stayed with him. He stood, reached into the truck for an old plastic scoop he used for potting soil, and came back to the barrel with a new resolve. If there was something at the bottom of this container, he needed to know. Slowly, methodically, he began to scoop rice out onto the tarp, letting it pile into a growing, pale mound. The grains made a soft, continuous sound as they fell, like dry rain. He worked carefully, aware of the strain in his lower back but unwilling to stop midway. With each layer he removed, the idea that someone might have hidden something deep beneath the surface grew more plausible. Not certain, but plausible. And if there was one thing his years in maintenance had taught him, it was that most puzzles had an answer if you were willing to dig far enough. As the level in the barrel dropped, the pattern of sound began to change. At first it was subtle, the faintest difference in the way the rice landed. Then, as he scooped deeper, he heard a dull, muted tap, as if a handful of grains were striking something more solid than plastic. He paused, listening. The next scoop confirmed it, a soft clatter against something that did not give. A slow, electric chill ran up his spine. He set the scoop aside and reached down with both gloved hands, pushing the remaining rice to each side until his fingertips met a flat, unyielding surface. Not the curved bottom of the barrel. This was something else. Something separate. Something that had been placed there intentionally and buried beneath the weight of all those grains. Harold stayed very still, his hands resting on that hidden object through the thin barrier of rice, feeling its edges, its chill, its unspoken story pressing upward. In that moment, the storage unit around him seemed to hold its breath again. The other barrels loomed in his peripheral vision, closed and silent, like onlookers at the edge of some private discovery. Whatever he had just touched was not supposed to be found by accident. It had been hidden by someone who trusted that most people would never think to look beneath a barrel full of rice. But he had looked. And now, standing there alone in the dim, cool air of Unit 47, he had to decide whether he would go all the way and drag it into the light. Harold steadied himself with one hand on the rim of the barrel, the other brushing the last layer of rice aside until the hidden surface showed a faint, metallic sheen through the grains. His breath caught at the sight of it. The object felt cold even through his gloves, colder than anything else in the unit, as if whatever waited inside it had been holding onto the darkness for years. He leaned down carefully, slid both hands along the edges, and felt the tight, rectangular outline beneath the rice. A case, metal and heavy, with corners sharp enough to press through the thin barrier of grains. For a moment he simply knelt there, his heartbeat loud in his ears, the quiet around him settling into a stillness that made the entire storage unit feel alive. He did not yet know what he had found, but he knew instinctively that it was not something someone would bury unless they wanted it hidden from the world. That single thought brought a thin sting of fear to the back of his throat. He drew a long breath, anchored his feet, and pulled the case upward through the mound of rice, the grains sliding off its surface in soft rivers, leaving behind a dull metal shell scarred by old scratches and time. When he set it on the tarp beside him, the weight of it hit first. It was much heavier than he expected for its size, dense in the way that tools or machinery parts sometimes were. But this wasn't a toolbox. The contours of the case didn't match any industrial kit Harold had ever handled. It was square, not rectangular, with reinforced corners and a sealed latch that looked almost too clean compared to the rest of it. He crouched beside it, the tarp crackling under his knees, and ran his thumb across the latch. No lock. No padlock hole. Just a simple clasp someone had snapped shut with confidence, sure that no one would go digging through a barrel of rice to find it. For a moment, Harold hesitated. Years of working in maintenance had taught him that things hidden in strange places often carried stories better left unexplored. And yet, the weight of the case, the deliberate way it had been buried, stirred something in him. A recognition that this moment was bigger than curiosity. It felt like the kind of moment life put in front of you only once, the kind that asked whether you were willing to step forward into uncertainty even when your hands were shaking. He lifted the latch slowly, half expecting it to resist, half expecting something inside to shift. Instead, it opened with a quiet click, the lid rising on hinges that moved too smoothly for something left at the bottom of a barrel. Inside was a layer of worn cloth, what looked like an old work shirt, folded over itself several times as if someone had wrapped the contents with care. The fabric was stiff near the edges, the color faded into an indistinct gray-green. Harold's fingertips hesitated above it. Whoever had wrapped this had done so with precision, not hurriedly or carelessly. That alone made the small hairs along his arms lift. He peeled the cloth back gently, layer by layer, and each turn revealed a glimmer of metal or a flash of something pale beneath. It took only seconds for the truth of the case to emerge, and when it did, he felt his breath leave him in a single, silent exhale. Laid inside the case were objects that did not belong in a storage barrel, let alone buried beneath a mound of rice. A gold bracelet, delicate and thin, lay curled like a small, sleeping creature against the metal bottom. Beside it, a pair of earrings with stones that caught even the dim light of the unit, scattering it across the inside of the case. A watch, old but elegant, its leather strap cracked yet still rich in color. Small pieces of jewelry wrapped in soft paper sat tucked in the corners, their edges yellowed with age. Harold stared, unable to speak, though there was no one to speak to. These were not scrap metal trinkets. These were items someone valued. Someone who either lost them or hid them for reasons he could not begin to guess. He felt a dull ache creep into his chest, not of fear but of confusion. Who would bury something like this under 20 inches of rice? Who had wanted it kept safe in a place so impossible to stumble upon that only a man desperate for a second chance would uncover it? He closed the lid halfway, staring at the metal exterior as if it might explain itself. But the silence of the storage unit settled around him again, reminding him that answers were not going to be given so freely. Harold took a careful step back and let his memories drift to the people he used to work with. Men who kept secrets in their toolboxes, men who stashed money in hollow machine parts, men who hid lottery tickets under floor panels until payday. People hid things in strange ways. But this still felt different. More deliberate. More complicated. More dangerous, if only because of how unusual it was. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the slow throb behind his eyes that came when he was trying too hard to make sense of something without all the pieces. The case wasn't dangerous in itself. It wasn't illegal to find jewelry in an abandoned unit. But the thought of someone packing these valuables away so deeply made a knot of unease twist inside him. He set the case aside and studied the open barrel again, as if expecting to find another hidden compartment beneath the remaining rice. The sight of the nearly empty container, with grains scattered across the tarp in uneven heaps, made him realize how much effort someone had put into hiding that one box. It made the rest of the barrels loom larger in his mind. 15, 20, who knew how many secrets stacked in heavy plastic walls? Rice in one. Something else in the next. And if the second one was as strange as the first, then he might be walking into something he was entirely unprepared for. The thought tightened his throat. He could close the unit right now, store the case in his truck, and take days to think through the implications. But that meant leaving the other barrels untouched, leaving questions unanswered, leaving a door half open in his own life at a time when he needed clarity more than fear. Harold turned toward the gray barrel nearest the back wall, the one with a faint number scrawled on its side in red marker. He placed both hands on it and tried to tilt it slightly. The barrel didn't budge. Not even an inch. It was heavier than the first, heavier in a way that suggested it was filled nearly to the brim. He gripped the sealing ring, braced himself, and forced it open with steady pressure, feeling the strain in his arms and shoulders. The moment the lid loosened, a faint puff of dust drifted upward, carrying with it a dry smell that reminded him of construction sites. Earthy, granular, familiar. He lifted the lid fully and stared down at a barrel filled not with rice but with coarse, gray sand. Fine enough to pour, heavy enough to pack into a cold, granular mass. He dipped his fingers in, feeling the grit cling to his gloves, and his stomach tightened again. Another barrel filled with something ordinary on the surface, but placed in a context so strange that ordinary no longer felt like the right word. He scooped a handful of sand aside and saw the surface settle into a smooth, even layer. No hidden glint. No unexpected hardness beneath. If the rice had made sense only in the most confusing way, the sand made even less. Why hide anything in sand? Why use two different materials? Why bury valuables in the first and nothing in the second? Or was there something deeper still? He found his old soil scoop again and began to work through the sand with slow, steady strokes. The scrape of metal against grit echoed faintly through the unit, the sound building a strange rhythm that steadied him. Scoop, sift, search. Scoop, sift, search. But as the level dropped, nothing appeared. No case. No hidden object. No glimmer of metal. Only more sand spilling onto the tarp like the remnants of a long-forgotten beach. By the time he reached the bottom, his back ached and his doubts had doubled. Maybe the first barrel had been the only one hiding anything of worth. Maybe everything else was just remnants from someone with eccentric habits. But then his hand struck something solid, not the bottom plastic, but a small cylindrical shape half buried beneath the final layer of sand. He grasped it, lifted it free, and brushed the remaining grit away. It was a metal tube about the length of his forearm, capped at both ends with tightly sealed screw tops. Industrial looking. Heavy. Completely out of place in a barrel of sand. Harold turned it over in his hands, searching for clues. No markings. No labels. No identifying features. It was a container made for something precise, something someone didn't want to mix with everything else. For a moment, panic flickered in his chest. An echo of those warnings about sealed containers, unknown chemicals, potential hazards. He tapped one capped end lightly. The sound was hollow, not pressurized. He shook it gently, nothing moved inside. That eased the edge of fear, but not entirely. He set it aside carefully, noting how the uneasiness in his stomach hadn't faded with reassurance. Whoever owned these barrels had cataloged their life in a language Harold couldn't yet read. He stood slowly, stretching his stiff back, and looked around at the unit once more. 2 barrels opened. 2 mysteries uncovered. A case of jewelry buried under rice. A sealed industrial tube hidden beneath sand. And ahead of him, lined up in expectant silence, were more containers than he could process in a single afternoon. The air in the unit felt heavier now, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Harold rubbed a hand over his jaw and felt a tremor of uncertainty ripple through him. Whatever story these barrels held, it was not simple. It was layered, intentional, and perhaps far stranger than he'd let himself believe the day he bought the unit. As he reached for the next barrel's ring, pausing only to steady his breathing, he couldn't help the quiet thought that slid unbidden into his mind. If the first 2 had been this unsettling, what in the world waited inside the rest? Harold stood in the dim unit for a long moment, letting the unease settle deep in his body, the same way cold used to settle into his bones during winter shifts at the old plant. 2 barrels open, 2 strange discoveries, and the feeling that he had barely scratched the surface of whatever story these containers were hiding. He wiped his gloves clean against his jeans, not that it helped much with the sand still clinging to them, and let his gaze sweep across the remaining barrels. Some stood with faint scratches that suggested they'd been dragged across rough floors. Others looked almost new, the plastic smooth and unmarked except for dust. A few had lids slightly different in shape, older models, maybe, or made for specific industrial purposes. The silence wrapped around him as he stepped toward the next container, the gray one with a slightly dented side. He didn't know why, but something about that small dent made it feel more approachable, like a flaw in the armor of an otherwise intimidating wall of plastic. He braced his feet and worked the ring loose, this time more confidently, though still with the careful respect that years in industrial work had drilled into him. The lid lifted with a soft groan of plastic, and the air that rose from inside carried a faint, unfamiliar scent, not chemical, not sour, just strange. He leaned closer, shining his flashlight into the barrel's depths. What he saw made him blink twice, uncertain whether his eyes were playing tricks on him. Nestled inside, stacked in uneven rows like some bizarre collection, were dozens of small metallic spools, thin coils of copper wire wound tightly and bound with narrow strips of tape. They looked like parts of an electrical project, but far too organized, too meticulously arranged to be scrap. Harold reached for one, turning it in his hand. It was heavy for its size. The copper gleamed faintly under the thin film of dust. He recognized craftsmanship, but not the purpose. Someone had wound these by hand. A lot of them. And then stored them in a barrel like this was a private archive. He placed the spool back carefully and stepped away. Something was wrong here, not in a dangerous way but in a deeper, more unsettling sense. Whoever had owned this unit hadn't been careless. They had been deliberate in ways Harold could not yet decipher. First rice, then sand, then jewelry buried like a secret no one should find, then a sealed metal tube. Now coils of intricate wirework. Everything pointed to a pattern, something layered, encoded in the person's mind who filled these barrels. Harold rested his hand on the next barrel, the plastic cool and rigid beneath his glove. He could feel the faint pulse of his heartbeat in his fingertips. He remembered a man he used to work with at the plant, a quiet engineer everyone respected but few understood. The man had kept binders full of sketches no one else could interpret. Complex diagrams filled with loops and arrows that seemed to circle into themselves. Sometimes he brought pieces of projects from home, setting them down on workbenches with cryptic notes. People like that saw the world in a way Harold never could, building patterns that only made sense to them. The barrels felt like the legacy of such a mind, isolated, private, and deeply intentional. He pulled open the lid of the next barrel and his breath halted again. Inside, stacked carefully like fragile cargo, were glass jars, dozens of them, each sealed, each filled with what looked like carefully sorted metal pieces. Not scrap metal. Not trash. These were tiny, precision machine components, maybe parts of an old hobby or small-scale manufacturing project. Springs, screws, little mechanisms Harold couldn't name but recognized as valuable in the right hands. He lifted one jar, watching the way the metal caught the light through the glass. This wasn't random clutter. It was an inventory, an organized catalog locked away inside barrels instead of shelves. He set the jar down gently, feeling the first threads of an idea pulling at him. This person, whoever they were, hadn't just been hiding valuables. They had been hiding pieces of themselves. A hobbyist? An inventor? Someone paranoid? Someone who didn't trust people? Or someone who had trust broken so badly they couldn't let anything meaningful sit in plain sight again? The air felt warmer now, though that could have been Harold's rising pulse. He moved to the next barrel without pausing, driven by a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. The ring released with a metallic snap, and when he lifted the lid, a coarse smell rose, earthy, musty like old soil. But not soil. As his flashlight passed over the surface, he realized the barrel was filled with gravel. Coarse, heavy gravel like what workers sometimes used for drainage or construction foundations. Another decoy. Another disguise. He dug his hands into it, feeling the jagged edges press into his gloves, and began to scoop it aside. The gravel was heavier than the rice or sand, and his shoulders soon protested the effort. But he kept going even when his back ached, determined not to leave anything half-finished. When the pile had shifted enough to expose the bottom, he saw nothing, not even the faintest glint of metal or shape of something hidden. For a moment disappointment washed through him, sharp, almost childish. The first barrel had rewarded him. The second had teased him. The next two had puzzled him. But this one, nothing. He straightened up slowly, bracing his hands on his hips, breathing hard. Maybe that was the point. Maybe some barrels held secrets and some were just noise designed to bury the truth under layers of misdirection. The person who filled them could have wanted anyone snooping around to stop early, to be misled into thinking everything was junk. Harold rubbed the back of his neck. He could feel the weight of time pressing on him, the hours slipping away, the way the afternoon light had changed into a muted gold outside the open door. He couldn't stop now. Each barrel he opened deepened the mystery instead of solving it, and that contradiction pulled him forward. He reached for the next lid, tugged the ring loose, and lifted it with a slow, weary motion. Inside lay a different kind of puzzle. 3 neatly packed toolboxes stacked one atop the other, their plastic surfaces scratched but intact. These were high-quality boxes, brand name, the kind professionals used, not hobbyists. He pulled the top one out, set it on the tarp, and opened the latches. Inside were tools he recognized instantly, precision screwdrivers, small wrenches, fine pliers, all expensive, all in excellent condition. The second box held more tools, measuring instruments, calipers, small clamps. The third held a mix of items, a few pieces of jewelry, a leather pouch, and something wrapped in a cloth. Harold unfolded the cloth slowly, studying each movement as if it might reveal intention. Inside was a small, silver pocket watch with a delicate engraving on the back. His breath caught again. This wasn't industrial equipment. This wasn't random. This was personal. A memory. A legacy. Something someone cared for deeply. Harold set the watch down gently, his hands trembling just slightly. The sunlight had shifted again, creeping into the unit in a narrow beam that illuminated the dust in the air. He sat back on his heels and let the truth settle into him. Not the truth of what each barrel contained, but the truth that everything here had been placed with meaning. Someone had lived a life that threaded through these objects. The rice, the sand, the gravel, the coils of copper, the jars of components, the tools, the jewelry. Each piece belonged to a story he couldn't yet see clearly. It frightened him in a quiet way, not because he thought he was in danger but because he felt as though he had stepped into a stranger's mind, one compartment at a time. He moved to another barrel, one of the last in the front row, determined to push a little farther before his energy failed him. But as he lifted the lid, the cold air inside made him pause. There were no grains, no coils, no jars. Instead, lying across the bottom like relics from a forgotten project were old electronics, cameras, small lenses, disassembled circuit boards. Some belonged to decades-old technology. Others were still modern enough to fetch real value. His heart thudded once hard. This was no longer a question of whether there was something inside these barrels worth selling. It was a question of how much. He touched a camera gently, recognizing the weight of quality. Cameras like this weren't cheap. Neither were the lenses. He sat back again, a heavy breath leaving him. The barrels weren't junk. They were a hidden treasury. And yet the disorder, the baffling mix of materials, the strange layering, all of it told a story he couldn't yet understand. He looked at the remaining barrels, now fewer than before but still many, each one holding the possibility of another discovery he was not prepared for. His body ached from lifting and digging, his mind swirled with questions he couldn't form into coherent thoughts. But beneath the confusion, beneath the fatigue, a new feeling pulsed quietly in his chest, a cautious spark of hope. Not certainty, not relief, but hope. And hope, for a man like Harold who had lived too long in the long shadow of regret, was its own kind of miracle. He stood slowly, stretching stiff muscles, and let his eyes settle on one of the remaining barrels, a black one, tall and imposing, its lid unmarked. Something about it made his breath hitch slightly. Maybe intuition. Maybe imagination. But as he reached for the sealing ring, his fingers paused. A faint sound, so faint he almost doubted it, seemed to echo from deep within the barrel's plastic shell. Not movement. Not scraping. Just a shift. As though something inside had settled when he touched it. And in that moment, as he leaned closer, heart climbing up his throat, Harold realized he was not ready for whatever waited inside. Not yet. Not alone. Harold returned to the storage unit early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen, carrying the quiet determination of a man who had spent most of the night thinking rather than sleeping. His body was stiff, his mind restless, but something inside him felt steadier than it had in a long time. He had reached a point in this strange journey where fear and exhaustion no longer guided him. Only the sense that finishing what he had begun mattered more than the uncertainty waiting at the bottom of another barrel. The dawn painted the yard in pale light, casting long shadows across the concrete, and for the first time since buying the unit, Harold felt like the day belonged to him rather than standing against him. He unlocked the door and rolled it up, letting the cool air rush out, bringing with it the familiar smell of dust, plastic, and the faint metallic tang that had settled over the past few days. The barrel stood unchanged, but he had changed. And that difference mattered. He walked straight to the black barrel that had unsettled him so deeply the evening before, its surface gleaming faintly in the muted light. He rested his gloved hand on its lid again, half expecting the faint internal shift he'd imagined the night before to return. But the barrel was silent, still, and strangely calm. Perhaps it had been nothing more than his frayed nerves. Perhaps it had been something real. In the end it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was ready to face it now. He loosened the sealing ring carefully, using slow, steady pressure until it released with a deep, resonant snap that echoed through the unit like a starting bell. The lid lifted without resistance. Inside, instead of sand or rice or gravel, Harold saw layers of heavy canvas folded over themselves, forming a dense cushion that filled nearly half the barrel. He pulled back the first layer, then the second, feeling the weight of the fabric anchor his movements. Beneath it, nestled tightly between padded sides, lay several wooden boxes, smooth, polished, and unmistakably handmade. He reached for the closest box, lifting it with both hands. It was surprisingly light, almost delicate compared to everything else he had found. The lid slid open with a quiet whisper, revealing rows of small metal instruments, tiny gears, hand-etched plates of brass, and a few fragile mechanisms that looked like pieces of old clocks. Not expensive in themselves but crafted with care, the kind of objects someone spent evenings making for the comfort of working with their hands. He opened another box. More crafted parts. More fragments of someone's quiet world. And then, beneath the third box, he saw something that made his breath catch. A leather journal, bound with a thin strap, its edges worn soft from years of handling. Harold lifted it reverently, the smell of aged pages rising like a whisper from the past. He untied the strap and opened the cover with gentle fingers. The journal wasn't filled with words. It was filled with drawings, hundreds of them. Detailed sketches of mechanisms, gears, personal projects, diagrams that spiraled across the pages in patterns Harold couldn't fully understand. But between those diagrams, tucked into corners and margins, were lines of handwriting, dates, brief notes, and small personal markers. For my granddaughter one day. Learn to build it better. Store everything safely. Don't let it be thrown away. That sentence appeared more than once. And suddenly everything clicked into place. These barrels weren't the hiding place of a criminal or a paranoid recluse. They were the legacy of someone who had spent a lifetime making things, collecting things, repairing things. Someone who had nowhere else to put the pieces of his world. Someone who had wanted it preserved. Someone who hadn't known how to ask for help or hadn't had anyone left to ask. Harold closed the journal slowly, his throat tightening. He understood that kind of loneliness more than he wanted to admit. He placed the journal aside carefully and continued through the barrel, discovering more wooden boxes, more handmade mechanisms, more fragments of a quiet, private life. Yet mixed among them were items far more valuable. Several watches in pristine condition, a handful of silver coins, and a velvet pouch containing 2 gold necklaces that caught the morning light. These weren't scattered randomly. They were curated, preserved, wrapped with intention. It was as if the previous owner had been assembling not just a collection but a time capsule of everything meaningful he had ever touched. And as Harold lifted each piece, he felt something soften inside him. Not fear, not confusion, but empathy. People didn't always leave behind clean, organized stories. Most people lived messy, complicated lives that ended too quietly. Maybe this man had no one left. Maybe he had tried to leave a trail for someone to find someday. Or maybe all of this had been a way to keep his hands busy, to give himself purpose in a world that grew smaller with age. When Harold stepped back from the open barrel, he felt a gentle shift not in the plastic but in himself. There was no longer anything frightening about the containers, no hint of danger, no sense of trespass. Only the weight of someone else's unfinished story, and the unexpected responsibility of deciding what came next. He stacked the wooden boxes carefully, placed the journal atop them, and let his gaze drift across the rest of the unit. He had opened nearly every barrel now. He had found jewelry, vintage lenses, collectible cameras, industrial tools, electrical components, and oddities he didn't yet know the names for. He had also uncovered enough valuable items to change his life in ways he once thought impossible. But what mattered more was the quiet clarity settling in his chest. He wasn't here to solve a mystery anymore. He was here to honor it. He spent the next 2 days sorting everything with the care the previous owner had never been able to give it. He separated the truly valuable items from the sentimental ones, packed the fragile mechanisms, cleaned the lenses and cameras, and arranged everything across his living room floor like a massive, intricate inventory. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. His hands were steady, his mind focused, and the ache of loneliness that had settled over him since retiring felt lighter, thinned by purpose. When he finally took the jewelry to a reputable buyer, the woman behind the counter raised her eyebrows at the pieces. She called in a second appraiser. Then a third. By the end of the afternoon, Harold walked out with a check that made his hands tremble, not because of fear but because of disbelief. $56,000. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to buy a reliable car. Enough to visit his daughter and granddaughter instead of sending distant apologies over the phone. Enough to build trust again. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long moment, holding the check gently between his fingers, feeling the weight of it settle into the hollow places inside him. He thought of the journal with its quiet notes. Of the barrels stacked like silent witnesses. Of the man who had spent years building, repairing, collecting. A life could be measured in many ways. In money, in relationships, in creations left behind. But sometimes it was measured in second chances offered to strangers without ever intending to. Harold folded the check carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. The decision came to him silently, without ceremony. He would drive to his daughter. He would apologize without excuses. He would be present even if it meant swallowing old pride. Life was short. Too short to waste the pieces of it someone had given back to him through a storage unit full of forgotten barrels. The drive took hours, winding through stretches of road that changed from flat desert to low hills and quiet fields. The weather was clear, the air gentle, and the old familiar ache of anticipation sat warm in his chest. When he reached his daughter's street, he parked at the curb, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, each version ending differently, some hopeful, some painful, all uncertain. But when he stepped out of the truck and walked to her door, his heart pounding harder with each step, the only thing that truly mattered was that he had come. He knocked once. Then again. The porch light flickered as the door opened. His daughter stood there, surprise washing across her face, followed by something softer, confusion, hesitation, then the smallest flicker of hope. He spoke quietly, his voice thick despite his best efforts. "I'm sorry. I should have come sooner. I should have done better." She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. The living room was warm, lived in, filled with the smell of coffee and something baked earlier that morning. His granddaughter peeked from behind the doorway, shy at first, then smiling when she saw him. The three of them sat together, awkward at first, then slowly easing into the gentle rhythm of conversation that had been lost for too long. He told them the truth, not everything about the barrels, not the strange details that wouldn't make sense outside the dim light of the storage unit, but enough for them to understand the meaning of what he had been given. Enough for them to understand why he had come. Weeks passed. Then months. The storage unit eventually emptied, its contents sold, donated, or kept only as mementos. The journal stayed with Harold, resting on a shelf beside old family pictures, a quiet reminder of how unexpected gifts sometimes arrived disguised as burdens. With the money he kept enough for security and gave the rest toward his granddaughter's future, watching the gratitude in his daughter's eyes ease years of old tension. He fixed his roof, replaced his worn-out truck, and found part-time work at a local repair shop where his hands felt useful again. But the true treasure he gained was not the jewelry or the cameras or the vintage tools. It was the feeling of belonging, the warmth of family dinners, the laughter of a child who finally knew her grandfather. In the evenings, Harold often sat on his porch as the sun lowered over the quiet street, letting the glow settle across his face. He thought of the barrels, the rice, the sand, the secrets hidden under layers of time. He thought of the man who had left behind a life arranged in containers only someone persistent enough, or desperate enough, would open. And every time he thought of it, the same lesson settled deeper into his heart. Life rarely handed out second chances in neat boxes. Sometimes they came disguised as work. Sometimes as fear. Sometimes as mysteries too tangled to understand fully. But when they came, the only real mistake was turning away. Harold leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint laughter of his granddaughter drifting through the open window. He smiled to himself, grateful, humbled, healed in ways he hadn't expected. The barrels had once frightened him. Now they felt like the beginning of everything good that followed. And every time he closed his eyes, he offered a silent thank you to the stranger who had left behind a lifetime of hidden things, and, without meaning to, handed him a future worth living again.